Hello, if you're new here, my name's Mia and I like talking about books and writing and art, and the video that I'm going to make today is about memories I associate with specific books. And this video is inspired by Patti, who made a very similar video that I've linked down below. And so basically I'm going to be talking about books that are important to me because of the memories that I associate with them, and I'm not really going to be talking about what the books are about, but yeah, just what they've meant to me. So let's get started. The first book that I'm going to talk about is The Black Unicorn by Lorde, and I read this book at the very beginning of lockdown, like maybe one of the first couple of days where we were at home, and I remember going out to the backyard with a camping chair to read this book. And I remember the neighbor was mowing the lawn, so it was really loud. So I started reading it aloud to myself. And I had the most beautiful experience with this book of just speaking the words aloud to myself and really taking it in. It's also just such a fantastic book, and it's the thing that kickstarted my love for poetry. I think this is one of the first poetry collections I read, and then I remember for the rest of the lockdown and beyond, I just read so much poetry. Then I started writing my own poetry, and it all comes back to this book actually. So yeah, it's very special to me, and I have a lot of fun memories about reading it and just what it represents for me. So that's my first special book. And the next books that I'm going to talk about are these books by Patti Smith. I have a few memories attached to these. So the first one, these three here, they were actually in a charity shop in a little stack like this, and I grabbed them as soon as I saw them, and I kind of couldn't believe it. And when I brought it to the counter, the woman was like, I just put these on the floor and I knew someone who loved Patti Smith would come by and be so happy. And I'm just so lucky that it was me. So I remember that moment with these three books. And it was a little bit after that that I actually read them. I read all 5 of these books in the span of like 1 week when I was away with my mum. After I finished high school, we went away together for a week to a little cottage on this farm in a small town not too far from Sydney, and I'd brought all these books with me, read them all and loved them all, so they remind me of my mum, so they have a really special place in my heart and just remind me of that beautiful week that we spent together. So yeah, those are the memories that I associate with these books. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Wild by Cheryl, and the memories that I associate with this book are when I went camping with my girlfriend sometime early last year, and the weekend that we went camping, it was pouring rain, so we were just like sitting in the tent together, and I was reading this book, and it was just at the time that I decided that I was going to go on this 2-week hike in the Australian outback. I just discovered this track called the Larapinta Trail, and as soon as I heard about it, I was like, I have to do this. And I ended up doing it a few months later. But this book reminds me of actually the deciding moment when I knew that it's something that I wanted to do, and I was reading this and just feeling so excited about my own walk. And yeah, we were camping in the rain, and it was actually a really beautiful weekend. So I think of it really fondly. The next book I don't own actually, but it's called The Museum of Modern Love, and I was listening to this audiobook last year when I was at work, and one of the things that I do for work is I assist a couple of artists in their studios, and this particular day I was in the studio by myself, and I was just hand sewing all day listening to this audiobook. And it was so fantastic. I chose that book because I recognized the cover from when I used to work at a women's library a few years ago. And I remember this book was on the shelf with a little staff recommendation plaque, and it was kind of stored in my mind. So when I saw that this was available on the audiobook app, I just started listening and absolutely loved it. And I'm so glad that I remembered that, because I don't see it in bookshops anywhere, and I'm actually on the hunt for it at the moment because I would love a physical copy and I want to reread it. I think I listened to it all in one go and then on the way home because I just loved it so much. So it reminds me of a beautiful day I spent by myself sewing and was just blown away by this book. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Girl, Woman, Other, and actually this is another book that reminds me of what I was reading during COVID. I think that I borrowed the ebook of this on one of my library ebook apps, and absolutely loved it. It's so fantastic and it plays with form in interesting ways, and I hadn't read anything like it. And I remember that this is the first book that I bought when we could go to bookshops again after lockdown. Actually, I want to reread this again because it's been a while and I just remember loving it so much. The next book that I associate with a specific memory is There Lives a Young Girl in Me Who Will Not Die. And this is a poetry book that I read earlier this year, a few days after I had my wisdom teeth removed. So I remember I was like lying in bed and I had just bought this book, so I was reading it and I loved it, and I had my pencil and I was underlining the lines that I liked, dog-earing the pages that I loved. So yeah, it reminds me of being at home in those days after my wisdom teeth were removed, and it's a positive memory because of this book. So yeah, that's what I associate with this book. The next one that I want to talk about is Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. And this is another book that I read earlier this year and I absolutely loved it. I remember reading it on the bus on the way to work. I also work at a coffee shop, so I was reading it on the bus, couldn't stop thinking about it all my shift, read it on my break, couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the day, read it on my way home when I was at home, and it was one of the books that totally consumed my thoughts while I was reading it. I remember for days while I was reading this book, I had a very particular feeling in my chest and kind of in my throat. It kind of felt like I was always on the verge of tears, and there was almost a tightness in my chest because I was just thinking about this book so much, and I feel like it brought up so many emotions. And yeah, I remember that particular week when I was reading this book, I had just this feeling in my body. So yeah, I remember that week really clearly because of how I felt reading this book. And I remember I was reading it really slowly actually because I didn't want it to end. And that's not something that I often do, but I really was consciously slowing down so much, going back and rereading passages because I loved it so much. The next book is one that I found in one of those little street libraries, and it's this book of essays. It's falling apart. There's this book of essays called In Favour of the Sensitive Man and Other Essays by Anaïs Nin. I just looked up how to say her name. I think that's right. So I found this book and it wasn't falling apart at the time, but when I went to read it, but the memory that I associate with this book is bringing it to the skate park when my girlfriend and her friends were skating and I was just like sitting on the side. When I started reading it, I was loving the essays, but the book was quite literally falling apart. When I opened it up, I could feel the spine cracking, and that's when it kind of started to fall apart. And so I kind of took off the pieces, read like the first section first, was underlining all these amazing lines, and I was like, I'll figure out how to fix this later. But I was pleasantly surprised with this book because I'd read something else by her. Actually, I read some of her like erotic short stories and I really didn't like them. I think that like she's such a fantastic writer. Since then, I've read some of her essays and some of her diaries, and her writing is so fantastic, but it just like did not translate into her short stories. To be fair, I actually don't think that the short stories ever had the intention of being published. I think that they were written for like particular clients and then they were published later on. But yeah, I didn't really like the writing in those stories at all. But in these essays and in her diaries, it's so rich and so beautiful. And I was so pleasantly surprised with this book. So it reminds me of those moments and like trying to keep it together while I was reading it. But yeah. The next few books are associated with particular trips that I've taken. I think all of them, if not most of them, I bought while I was traveling and read on my trip. And the first book that I'm going to talk about is Writers and Lovers by Lily King. And I bought this while I was in Boston because I believe it's set in Boston. And I remember reading this a little bit while I was in the city, but also when I was on the train from Boston to New York. And I remember it was autumn, so all the leaves outside were orange and red and yellow, and it was just like a beautiful train journey. And I remember also reading this at some point in my trip in New York when I went to visit the Met cloisters, and it was kind of a little bit outside of the city. And I remember I had to go up kind of like a small hill, and again there were all these beautiful autumn leaves, and I found this little bench to sit at, and I think that's where I finished the book. So I remember that memory super vividly when I think of this book. I just loved it so much. On that same trip, I also went to San Francisco, and I went to a few independent bookshops, and I found this book, and it was one of the ones that had a staff recommendation plaque written for it, and I picked it up and I read the back, and let me see if I can find... Yeah, there was this moment when I was reading the back cover, and it says, "Cole writes of Paris. For a time, I lived here, where the call of life is so strong. My soul was colored by it. Instead of worshipping a creator or man, I cared fully for myself and felt no guilt and confessed nothing. And in this place I wrote. I was nourished and I grew." And I remember when I read that in the store, there were actual tears in my eyes, and I felt such a visceral reaction when I read that I knew I had to buy it. It was on my first solo trip, and I just really resonated with what he said, and it made me really emotional. So I think of that memory very vividly when I think of this book. The next book I bought when I was on a trip in Paris, and it's Obit by Victoria Chang. And the day that I bought this, I had gone from the bookshop to an art museum, and I can't remember the exact name of the museum, but it's the one where they had that whole room of water lilies by Monet on those like curved walls. And after I visited that museum, this book was in my bag, and I went and sat on one of those green metal chairs that are sometimes around like a fountain. And I was reading this book, and I remember it was really cold because it was December. There was a wind that was blowing. So I was kind of tucked up on my chair with my collar up, and my knees were tucked up, and I was just reading this book, and I did not move until I finished the book because it was so, so good. I feel like my mouth was open while I was reading this because I just could not believe how good the writing was. I underlined so, so much, and it was one of those things where I knew that I was going to come back so many times to kind of reread it, get inspiration for my own writing. I just like absolutely adored it, and I remember that day very clearly of being in Paris in the cold, but like not moving until I finished that book. And the last book that I'm going to talk about is one that I read recently that I've not stopped thinking about since I read it. So I just got back from a trip to Berlin. I was there for 2 months, and I'd seen this book in a couple of different bookshops, and I kept thinking about it. So on my last day, I was determined to find it, and it was Alphabetical Diaries by Sheila Heti. I ended up finding it in a bookstore called Do You Read Me? And it was a beautiful summer's day in Berlin. And I went around all my favorite spots in the city that I'd found in the past couple of months, and I just read this in all those spots. I actually read the whole thing that day, and I loved it so, so much. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. I underlined so much in it, and I remember just being in awe the whole day of this book and also of the city. So it reminds me of that whole trip, but in particular, that particular day. And the moment when I finished reading it, it was just like the last little bit of sunlight for the day. I'd closed the book when it just started getting dark, and then I was on my way back to the hostel. And I was honestly kind of in shock from reading it because it was so fantastic and it hit me so deeply. And now this is one of my new favorite books, actually. I really, really loved it, and I want to reread it really soon, actually. I do often flip through it and just see the moments that I highlighted and stuff. And I feel like it's inspiring me a lot for writing and art projects that I want to do. I'm not really sure if there's a direct correlation between this and the things I'm going to make, but I can definitely feel that it is like infiltrated my mind, and it's going to be quite a massive influence in some ways, whether I realize it or not. So those are my books, and I'm pretty sure I didn't describe what any of them were about, but let me know if you do want me to talk about any of them more in depth. Like I said, I love them all, and I associate them with like really beautiful memories in my own life, and I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you got to know me a little bit better in this way. Thank you to Patti for the idea, and yeah, I'll see you next time.